Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Nantucket Atheneum. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Amy Janess, for making every little thing happen so that I could be here indeed for the first time. And thank you, John, for inviting me. And I've written for the New York Times for a long time now. As it happens, I did not know Constance Laibe Hayes. But I know of her remarkable work, and I really consider it an honor to be asked to be here and to help to maintain her memory. So thank you. It's been, it just occurred to me that it's 20 years that I've been making a living as a writer of history, writing books of popular history. And it only recently occurred to me that many people have this mistaken idea that history is old. Historical data can be old, it can be ancient, of course, but history is new, history is fresh, and this occurs to me lately in part because of recent events. When we talk about history, the reason it changes all the time, the reason that people, regularly, every few years, there's a new biography of George Washington or whoever, is that we keep changing. And yes, sometimes facts are discovered, information about the past comes to light, but mostly history is retold because we keep changing. And this Supreme Court decision about gay marriage really has gotten me thinking about this. Of all the things that have been written about this in the wake of it, one thing that struck me was Andrew Sullivan, when he wrote his reflections, and he was talking about how when he would first appear on talk shows, I guess this was 15 years ago or so, and would bring up the concept of gay marriage, other people he was on panels with were just flummoxed at the whole, they couldn't wrap their mind around the concept of two men or two women becoming legally married, and lo and behold, it's the law of the land. We really change. Not everyone and not altogether, but things change, and so we have to revisit the past, not in order to reinvent it or to make up things that didn't exist, but because we change, when you look back at the data of the past, certain things come to the fore that before were buried, and vice versa. Other things that suddenly that used to seem so important now recede somewhat. So we're here in Nantucket Island. This is the first time I've been here, and it's wonderful, giving myself and my wife and my son a little crash course in the island. And we're really kind of in the cradle of, or it's almost like the island is cradled by the New England coast. And talking about American beginnings, they have long been told as a New England story, in particular as an English story, because you had New England and you had the Virginia colony. And that made good sense for a long time because of who people were and who they saw themselves as Americans. They wanted for a long time to think of themselves as having a core English identity. And certain things were important. I was living on Manhattan Island once upon a time, another island, and I was with my daughter. We lived in the East Village, and I took my daughter to the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery because that was the nearest place to our apartment where she could run around and play. She was, I guess, 2 years old, and she's now 20, so, history happens to you too. That's a lot of the first families of New York are buried there, and one of the people buried there is Peter Stuyvesant, who is the last director of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. And so that, I was aware, like most people are, I suppose, that New York began as New Amsterdam, and that the Dutch sort of muddled around there for a while, and that there was someone named Peter Stuyvesant, and that he had a wooden leg, and that was probably about the extent of my knowledge of it. And then as I asked around, because I've learned about myself as a writer that I tend to try to go to origins, and I wanted, this is certainly the origins, and it had been treated, the Dutch period, as kind of a preamble that doesn't really have to do with the proper history of New York. So I wanted to explore that further, and I talked to a number of historians of New York about the Dutch period, and they uniformly said they didn't know much about it. And eventually somebody pointed me to a man named Charles Goering, who since 1974 had been working, and in fact is still working, at the New York State Library in Albany, translating and publishing the archives of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. One of the things I had read in my early passes at trying to understand this period of history was that the Dutch presence was slight, and they didn't record much, and when the English took over, then it really got going. Well, one of the first things Charles Goering told me was that the corpus of material he's working with was 12,000 pages, and the 12,000 pages was only the archives of the colonial government, the correspondence and council minutes and things like that. There was also the New Amsterdam City Council records. There were lots of other collections of papers. So there went this notion that they didn't write much. And so he invited me to Albany, and as I spent time with him and the people around him, I started to realize that you could tell the story of American beginnings, not, say, from a New England perspective, but from a New York perspective, and it would be just as legitimate, not necessarily more legitimate, but it would be just as legitimate a stance. And you would end up, back to what I was talking about in terms of people changing and history changing, you end up then with a different sense of things. It highlights different things. And as John said, I have been living in Amsterdam for 7 years, and out of that came a book, A History of the City of Amsterdam, which to me is kind of a prequel to my book about Dutch New York. So what I'll do is talk a little bit about the New York book, and then I'll shift to Amsterdam, because that's really kind of the roots of the ideas, and then I'll come back to this country. So in meeting with these historians and a few archaeologists and genealogists and so on, I started to get this sense of New York, of New Amsterdam, of Manhattan Island, as a real linchpin. And it is an interesting contrast to the story that is told from a New England perspective. From a New England perspective, you have the Puritans and you have the Pilgrims coming from England to America, and they come for religious reasons. They have been persecuted, they want to start over, they want to create a new society. And they succeed, and as they succeed, they take that as God's favoring their enterprise. And so there is this kind of exceptionalism built into the story that they begin to tell. So that the first printing presses in America are in Boston, and the first books are the accounts of the first generation of Puritans written by the second and third generations. And that is the story that begins to become part of the American story, and it has, this very strong religious sensibility to it, and this exceptionalism. We have the right to this. And then when you get to the 19th century, and America has moved across the continent, that becomes the notion of manifest destiny, the idea that we have this right to the continent. And then when Woodrow Wilson comes into the White House, he consciously brings that global and says America is this idea, and we have a right to spread it beyond America's shores. So this idea that I'm going to explore a little bit for you in talking about New York and talking about Amsterdam doesn't supplant that. It doesn't say that that's wrong. It just says this is another way of looking at the story of American history and its foundings that is maybe a little bit more relevant to who we are today. And I think that's one thing that got me excited when I first met Charlie Goering and started working with him and his archives. The Dutch found this colony beginning 1609 with the voyage of Henry Hudson, and they establish a real base there in the 1620s. But what was it that they brought? So now let me switch to Europe, and I'll explore Amsterdam, and then I'll come back. The book that I wrote about Amsterdam, the subtitle is A History of the World's Most Liberal City. And by liberal, I wanted, first of all, to reference right off the bat the things that people associate with Amsterdam today, sex and drugs and things like that. So kind of lowercase l, liberal. But also, as I explore in the book, liberal in the very broad sense of a philosophy that puts individual freedoms at the center of things. And how this happens, I think, is a fascinating story, how that comes to be in that part of Europe. And it has everything to do with water. Europe, the part of Europe we think of as the Netherlands today, is relatively young in European terms. Rome is ancient, Greece is ancient. The Dutch provinces, the Netherlands, Dutch culture comes into being in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, the typical unit of society was the manor house. The manorial system was one in which in France or in Spain or in Italy or in England, you had a nobleman who lived in a fine house in a castle, and there was a lot of land that he controlled. And there were people who lived on that land and worked it, and they owed fealty to him, and they paid him rent, and he protected them. He was their judge when they had disputes, and he took care of them. And the manorial system was a fixed system. That meant wherever you were born to in it, if you were a serf, if you were a carpenter, if you were one of the guilds, the tradesmen's guilds, your child was going to be at that same rung, and your grandchild was going to be at that same rung. So it maintained itself for century after century. The part of Europe that I'm talking about, the Low Countries, is basically a river delta. It's three of Northern Europe's great rivers drain into the sea there. And so for that reason, it's a pretty inhospitable landscape. And people from the rest of Europe took a long time before they decided to start settling there. And when they did, they discovered in the spring that the field that they had previously planted with crops was now underwater, or another area, or their house was underwater, or another area that had been underwater suddenly was not. And so they got together in small groups and undertook this backbreaking work to create dams and dikes and to drain water from areas, and did this in order to create a stable landscape that they could then inhabit. And they created, the structure of this was called the water boards. These water boards were all over the country, and these water boards still exist everywhere in the Netherlands, and everybody pays a water tax. And this is starting to sound like a very relevant situation to other places nowadays. This is the problem of rising sea levels, so to speak, is one that they have been dealing with for more than 1,000 years. So they created these small communities. They got together and they created dams and dikes, and they created land that had not been there before. There's a saying in Dutch, God made the earth, but the Dutch made Holland. And they mean it literally, that they made land that wasn't there. If you were to look at a map of that part of Europe 1,000 years ago or 1,200 years ago and compare it with one from today, you would see that there is more than 50% of the land that's there now was not there before. So once they had done this, created this new land, it was not owned by a nobleman. It wasn't owned by a church or a king. It was theirs. And so they divided it up into parcels, and everybody who participated got parcels. And they began using them then. And they bought or sold or rented them, and they used them for a variety of purposes. They discovered that it was very good pasture land, so lots of cows. So using that to make cheese and butter, and out of that comes the famous Dutch obsession with cleanliness, but because butter in particular, you have to be scrupulously clean in the process. So they start making money, and they start to realize that unlike people in the rest of Europe who are kind of in this fixed system, they have the possibility of making a better life for the children than they had had. And so this then becomes kind of a switch that flips on in this culture. And they start innovating. And this innovation happens all across the board. And you can see it as you go from the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s. You can see this innovation take hold. And as it does, you can see them begin to excel. This tiny little part of Europe with this small population and this inhospitable climate start to take control of things. So just to give you one example, in the Middle Ages in Northern Europe, everybody fished the North Sea for herring. Herring was cheap and nutritious and plentiful. And what you did was you stayed with your ship close to the shore, and you fished, and you got it to market as soon as possible because, of course, it's perishable. So this series of innovations happens whereby the Dutch corner the market on herring. It begins probably with an accident. Somebody discovered that if, when you're processing the fish, you leave a portion of the liver in with the meat when you're packing it into barrels, it preserves it, and it also improves the flavor. So this meant that you could go further out to sea and get more fish at one go, and that, though, required a series of other innovations. So they developed something that was called a herring bus, which was basically a factory that could float through the pitching waters of the North Sea. In a herring bus, you had this whole team, and they invented this kind of assembly line of different workers who could work it and process 2,000 herring an hour. This whole infrastructure is built up around it. You have the fishing vessels, and you have the buses that are the factories, and then you have military vessels because this is a very valuable commodity, and so they need protection. So they corner the market on herring. Similar things happen in other industries. They now have an eye out. See, they have an eye out. They see possibilities. They're looking for possibilities. So their ships are in southern Italy, and they realize there's a bad grain crop. And meanwhile, in Poland, they've had a bumper crop. And so they quickly race to Poland, and they're supplying Polish grain to Italians. Another quick example, they saw that the raw materials for making soap were available at Baltic ports. So within a few years, 17 soap works spring up along the Amstel River in Amsterdam. And they did this additional kind of innovation then. All of these different supposedly competing soap works decide that they will all color their soap green, so that so if you're buying soap in England or in Italy or wherever, the green soap then, presumably their soap was good, and you associate it, and they're branding it, you associate it with Amsterdam. Oh, this is the good stuff, it's the green stuff. This whole series of innovations comes to a head in the year 1602. The year 1602 is the beginning of the Dutch Golden Age, when they develop another innovation of a different scale. A new kind of company comes into being. Companies had existed for a long time up to that point, and a company typically meant a group of people who have money and see the possibility of making money, pool their resources, and they back a venture, typically a voyage. They send ships out, they get the product, they bring it back, they divide up the spoils, and the company dissolves. In 1602, with the Dutch East India Company, they put on the first page of their prospectus that if you would like to become an owner of our company, you can buy what we're calling a share of stock. And that means after this next voyage, we're not going to go away. Our company is going to still be here. And we think that the company will increase in value over time, so that if you want, in the future, you could sell your shares of stock and make a profit off of the company itself and its fortunes. So the Dutch East India Company changed the world in so many ways. I mean, it exploited peoples on a scale that probably nobody had even imagined doing before. It set off this cycle of invasive species that we're still dealing with. But this, I think, is maybe the biggest thing. It invented this change that, in the case of the Dutch cities, and in particular Amsterdam, the Amsterdam Chamber was the largest chamber of the company. It allowed people in the society to play an active part in the economic life of their society. So 1602 becomes the beginning of the Dutch Golden Age when lots of other innovations, I've been talking about business terms, but innovations spill over into other fields. And pretty much anything that you could think of associated with the Dutch Golden Age then is related to this. And I'll just quickly go through a couple of things. Publishing. One of the most remarkable statistics I ever encountered was the estimate that in the course of the 17th century, 1/2 of all the books published in the entire world were published in the Dutch provinces, in this tiny corner of Europe. That speaks to this innovative sense, this sense of like there's something there, we can make money off of it, we can do something with this. And if you take that statistic one step further and calculate in the percentage of Dutch publishing houses that were in Amsterdam, it's something like 30% of all books published in the course of that century came out of Amsterdam. And publishing is a business in which you see opportunity and you seize it, but publishing is something else. It's a business that by its very nature seeds other ideas because it's about content, it's about ideas. So from that then, all kinds of scientific ideas come into being. So that Amsterdam becomes a center in Europe of science, of astronomy, of the people doing public anatomical dissections, and not just science qua science, but science in the sense of the industry, grinding lenses, making microscopes and telescopes and selling them, and publishing journals, publishing scientific journals. So this cycle, it feeds on itself. Art. Dutch art of the 17th century is probably most renowned for this turn away from the religious to the secular. But what does that mean exactly? If you take a particular artist of the period as an example, look at Rembrandt. Rembrandt moved from his home in Leiden to Amsterdam at the beginning of his career. And he very quickly became famous as a portrait painter. We think of him as this multifarious artistic genius. He got famous as a portrait painter. And if you look at his portraits, the portraits he painted of people, you begin to get a sense of everything that I have been talking about and talking about this uniqueness of that part of Europe. Because another way of looking at it is to say that this is kind of the rise of individuals, an individual sensibility, and a people who look at themselves something like the way that we look at ourselves. So that the people whose portraits he painted were a furniture maker and his wife, a herring merchant and his wife. I mean, not, terribly important people in the grand scheme of things, but every single one of those people has a Wikipedia page. I mean, every one of them, these portraits hang in the great museums of the world. And if you stand there and look at them, you start to get a sense why. Because there were a lot of Dutch artists at the time who could paint a portrait and paint what you look like. But Rembrandt seemed to be able to paint what was behind the eyes, who you really were. And that was exciting to these people in a way that people before that had not really felt. And so this is the beginning of the modern in a number of ways, and that's one of them. The city of Amsterdam itself then became a model of this whole notion that I'm talking about, the rise of the individual and of innovation and so on. Cities were organized according to the dictates of the rulers, of the most powerful. Amsterdam, as it built up around this idea, they built these canals, as I said before. Canals were part of the system of dealing with water so that you were channeling this problem to serve your needs. So they built these canals around the medieval center, and they lined them with canal houses. And the people who lived in the canal houses were, many of them, entrepreneurs of one sort or another. So that you could, if you were one of these in Amsterdam in the 17th century, you could follow the ship to the East Indies to collect the spices that you're hoping to buy, oversee the purchase, ride all the way back, this long voyage around the world, come into the Laibe, the harbor of Amsterdam, transfer with the goods to a smaller vessel, ride right up the canal to your doorstep, and Amsterdam canal houses have what's called a hoist beam at the top. It's a hook, and you haul the stuff up to the attic, and that was your storeroom, the attic. So you could ride from the far ends of the earth to your doorstep without touching dry ground and begin doing business. So that's how this whole city was built around these very people who were doing this individual innovating. So in all of these ways then, the Dutch Republic, the city of Amsterdam in particular, helped to spawn this new sense of an individual. And I should say that an individual that remains tied, what I started by talking about was we have to combat the water. So that means we all have to get together. We have to form a kind of collective. And out of that collective impulse, these people are empowered as individuals. And these strong individuals then don't lose sight of that need that because it was very pressing. If they all said, I'm going to go my own way, you're underwater again. So that balance stays in place. Okay, so now this society that's going great guns decides to found a colony in the New World in North America, and they do, and its capital is in the southern tip of Manhattan Island. And basically, so if you think about the American colonies, you think about the New England colonies and Virginia, basically everything in between, all are parts of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, some of Pennsylvania, and Delaware, was this Dutch colony of New Netherland. So when that society founds this colony, everything I'm talking about came along just because that's who they were. I didn't talk much about the kind of society that formed there. Because the Dutch provinces are flat, it's the Low Countries, it's easy to run to if you're fleeing war, if you're fleeing persecution. So there was a large concentration of minorities in Dutch cities, and this is something that visitors were constantly marveling at, that you would see people in turbans and people with dark skin, and and so when that society founded this new colony, that came along too. So that in 1643, a Jesuit priest who's in Manhattan reports that there are 18 languages being spoken, and there were only about 500 people there at the time. So, you might say New York was New York even before it was New York. So this mixed population, alive to innovation in a way that, by the way, other Europeans, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the notion of the idea, the slurs on the Dutch, people saying they're greedy and that they were godless and so on. Well, they were just as religious as other people. And I think what a lot of that comes from is other Europeans not understanding this kind of innovative impulse and this possibility, this way of looking at the future as something that's yours to grasp, which is very standard nowadays, but at that time it was hard for people to grasp. And so those things get transplanted to this New World culture, this New World society. The story that I talk about in my book, The Island at the Center of the World, is I kind of isolate it to a struggle between two members of the colony, the Dutch colony in Manhattan. Peter Stuyvesant, who was the establishment, he was the director of the colony. He worked on behalf of the Dutch West India Company, which was founded to try to repeat the success of the Dutch East India Company. And a man named Adrian van der Donck, who was nominated as kind of the representative of the people because the West India Company was trying to keep a monopoly on trade in the colony. And the people were, by virtue of everything I was just saying, seeing possibilities everywhere and wanting to do business. So this struggle takes place between them. At the climax of it, Stuyvesant imprisons van der Donck. Van der Donck's released. He goes to Europe to plead the case of the colony to the Dutch governing body. And in that, he says to them, he presents it before them, he presents a written story of this colony to the Dutch governing body. And while he's waiting for them to rule, he writes a book for popular consumption that's called A Description of New Netherland. And in that, he says, let me tell you about America. We have this colony there. People don't pay attention to it because they're all looking at the East Indies where all this money is coming from. But this colony sits astride a continent that's so vast we don't even comprehend how big it is. It has all of these resources. The trees are taller, the animals are bigger. And he says, because we have this notion, this mixed society, and I didn't mention Dutch tolerance, it was codified into Dutch law at a time when intolerance was official policy elsewhere in Europe. Because we have this notion of tolerance, we have kind of a social glue whereby this society functions. So we have all these ingredients in place there, but the English are massing in New England and they're massing in Virginia, and we need you, the Dutch government, to see what we've got there and to support us. And if you do, this colony will rise one day to outstrip the mother country in power. If you do not, he said, very prescient, the same thing will happen, but it will happen under the English, because everybody by then was afraid that the English were going to take over. And van der Donck actually won his petition. And 2 days later, Oliver Cromwell, the English leader, attacked the Dutch provinces. And the States General, the governing body, said, hold up, we want to rescind that order because you don't experiment with political reform in a time when you're under siege. So they canceled everything, except they still allowed a municipal charter for the city of New Amsterdam, so that New York still considers that date, February 1653, the date of its founding. And what that did is it cemented into the foundation of New York some of these elements of the Dutchness, the underlying Dutchness. So eventually then the English take over in 1664, as John mentioned. The English take over. New Amsterdam becomes New York, named after James the Duke of York, who was the brother of the king and the architect of this invasion strategy. And by the way, the plan was, by this point, England leaders are beginning to realize this notion of empire. So they've got these colonies in the Caribbean, and they're thinking, sugar is going to be a big thing. And we've got these colonies in North America, but they're disorganized. The king is back in power now, and Cromwell is out. The Puritan colonies were not so fond of the monarchy, so they had to, and the Dutch were right in the middle. So they had to, really come in with a firm hand. And so this takeover of the Dutch colony was part of that reorganization. So they rename New Amsterdam, New York. They rename the second Dutch city up the river, which was called Beverwijk. They renamed it Albany, which of course is the capital of New York. Also after the Duke of York, he was also the Duke of Albany. There was an idea to name New Jersey Albania after the Duke of Albany. And my little joke here is that there are some New Yorkers who still think of New Jersey as Albania. But a lot, so things changed superficially. But what the English realized was that this colony was a going concern, and in particular New Amsterdam was this thriving place. They didn't necessarily understand why it worked the way it did, but if you look at the articles of transfer, it reads kind of like an agreement between two equals. It doesn't read like, one has conquered the other. And that's because they didn't want things to change. So some of the first mayors of New York City, of English New York, are Dutch. The people, this mix of people who had settled this place didn't go anywhere. And in fact, notaries from the Netherlands kept sending people over, and they kept calling it New Netherland, even long after it had changed its name. So it functioned for a long time. And Dutch, I'm writing a book now, American history, and I'm in the 1750s, and there are places in upstate New York in the 1750s where, you have to find a translator because people in this region only speak Dutch, So Dutch persisted for a long time. This mix of ingredients that I'm talking about, if you jump ahead into the 19th century, when the great waves of people came over from Europe, Irish and French and German and Italians, they came to this place that was already a mix of different people. And by then it's this teeming multitude of different people. So they make footfall on Manhattan Island. They see this mass of different people speaking different languages and worshiping different faiths and all kind of clawing to get ahead by what we would call upward mobility. And they said, oh, well, this is America. No, it wasn't America. It was New York. And it was New York because it had been New Amsterdam. And a lot of them stayed, but a lot of them moved westward. And as they moved westward, they brought some sense of that idea with them. So when they went to Ohio, they went all the way to the Pacific. Elements of that went with them. So as a writer of history, I'm most interested in ideas and following ideas and how they shift and move. And it's frankly an impossible thing to do. You can't capture an idea, but I still think it's worthwhile. And so the notion of this struggle with water in this corner of Europe and how that triggers something in the people there, and then how that idea travels around the planet, and there are a number of other paths it took, not just this one, but in this case to the middle Atlantic region of North America, and then outward is something that I think is compelling, and I think it's one of the things that makes history new again. Thank you all. Thanks. And if anybody has any questions or comments or thinks I'm, entirely full of it, please say so.
Yes, I've got a question about context. With all that the British were doing globally in the 17th century, and also the Dutch, both as a military naval power and importantly commerce, how important was what was going on in New Amsterdam, New York, in the grand scheme of things, England and
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. He's asking, I'll repeat because he doesn't have a microphone on him. How important was New Amsterdam in the scheme of things with these two rising empires? It was very minor, very, very minor, which was the the problem that the Dutch in New Netherland had, that their leaders were acutely focused on Europe and these enemies they had all around them. And they were this tiny country that, in fact, what I didn't get into is they were fighting a war of independence against Spain throughout this whole period. And they were making money like mad, and they had these outposts in the East Indies. That's where their attention was. So this was not, that's why Van der Donck wrote this book and made this appeal. He's trying to get them to pay attention. And if you read the end of it where he sums up, it's remarkable how he goes into this dream of the future and how much it bears out. Yeah.
Mr. Shorto, besides the wooden leg of Peter Stuyvesant, we were taught in New York schools about Peter Minuet. There's a picture of Minuet in the Indians and $27 in trinkets. You used the word exploit. Was this an exploitation of the Indians, and is it a fact that it was trinkets?
Yeah. He asked about Peter Minuit, who was the second director of the colony, who famously bought the island of Manhattan from the Indians for $24, and basically what's up with that. I could talk for a long time about it, but I won't. The Dutch were meticulous businessmen, and we're gonna, and the Dutch also. They went around, they learned the different Indian languages. They were pretty savvy at the old thing that, we have our way, our approach to real estate and theirs is different, so we don't even understand. They understood that the Indians had a different approach, a different understanding of land ownership than they did. But from their perspective, they needed to have something in writing. And if we're going to be using this, the deed doesn't exist anymore, it's lost. But it presumably would have said, it would have taken into account the Indians' concept, which was more like entering into a mutual alliance. So the Indians would have been saying, we'll allow you in, and if we're attacked, you'll help us, and if you're attacked, we'll help you. So it was kind of a defensive alliance. It was trinkets. It was things that they used, things that they needed, cloth, things like that. But it was not, and then another thing that the Dutch understood perfectly well was the Indians didn't look at this as equal value. They looked at it as when you have a bargain, you put something in that's a token of this agreement between us. So it was a token amount. And it was in the 19th century that a translator tried to calculate that into then 19th century dollars, and that's where $24 comes from. Yeah.
In your book, you talked about how the West India Company sold literally tons of precious documents for scrap.
Yeah.
And the kind of documents that Charles Goering is still working on, they're like irreplaceable. And the thing that I find amazing is that they survived.
Yeah.
You've had contact with Charles Goering and everything, but who decided to keep them? Because obviously people don't have a high regard to see how precious that information is.
Yeah, he's asking about the survival of the records of the Dutch colony, and it's always such a wayward thing, what survives and what doesn't. I devote a portion of that book to the story of the records because I think that's a fascinating story in itself. Basically, first of all, whenever anybody, when a country goes in and invades another one or a colony, what you do is you get access to the records, particularly the real estate records, because you want to be able to have your hand on what's going on. And that's what the English did. They went into the fort, they knew where the office of the secretary was, and they said, these are ours, these records are ours. They then became part of the record, the next day, literally, the record starts in English, because it's a new secretary now, and he's the secretary of New York province. And so his record goes on top of the Dutch documents. So they were maintained as part of the records of the colony of New York. One of the interesting things that happens is in 1911, there is a fire in the state library in Albany. I think 3 million volumes were destroyed. And the great irony is that the Dutch records, because they were least accessed, were on the bottom of these filing cabinets. And so the English records fell over top of them and preserved them for the most part. So some of the ones that Charlie Goering still struggles with, I mean, the pages are like that, but it's like, it's like a circle that's left because, some of it was burned. But for the most part, they survived. So serendipity, they managed to survive. And there were attempts at translating them. There were people who had awareness. There's always some people who know what's going on, but to get, to mount a full-on translation effort and make it part of the public record. Making it part of the public record gets back to what I was saying before about how, what parts of history matter now versus what mattered to our grandparents, that kind of thing, if you take my point. Yes, sir.
I had always understood that European countries with small home markets became great colonial powers because the Portuguese, the Dutch, and to some extent the English, whereas Germany and others were big enough, they didn't have to push as much outside for trade and for building those empires. Is that accurate?
I think that's a fair you're broadening my point. He's saying that often small European countries were the ones that became the great trading powers because they had to. They didn't have, France. France, for example, created these huge armies to defend territory, and it was really like this chess game on the European continent. The Dutch couldn't possibly win at that game, but yet they had, this power of ideas and using ideas to see advantage far away. So I think that is a big part of their story. Now, the other side of that, if you look at the Dutch versus the English, is the way they went about that is very different. The Dutch would put down an outpost, and they would it would be a military/trading post, and depending on how friendly the locals were, they would fight with them or trade with them to get the things and then bring it back home. And so that was a good recipe for building up an empire in a short period of time. The English tended to establish cities, societies, and that's one reason why English is so widespoken today and Dutch is not. Yeah.
Didn't the Dutch also import slaves into New Netherlands?
Yeah. Yeah.
I know there's in New Jersey, the border between New Jersey and New York, Rockland and Bergen County, there's still a cluster of villages there that are they call them Jackson white people. There are people of African descent, but they all have Dutch names. The most common name is Van Duck. Mm-hmm. They're still there.
Yeah, yeah. He's asking about the role of slavery in the Dutch colony, and there were certainly slaves. The first slaves came. The Dutch West India Company first was trying to make its money on beavers, and then that didn't work, and on tobacco, and that wasn't working. And then the Europeans are beginning now to trade slaves in big numbers. So then they say, okay, we'll do that. And the first slaves in New Netherland came into New York Harbor. I said before, they were also fighting the Spanish. There was a war of independence. So Manhattan was a base in the western sphere of the war. And so they would raid Spanish ships in the Caribbean and bring them to New York. And the first slaves then were actually captured by the Spanish, which the Dutch recaptured. And then they started, you can sort of see them saying, maybe this is how we'll make money. So they're starting to do that. It was a very small percentage within the time period of the colony itself. They didn't really make a go of it. And I think that's only because it was right at the time, at 1664, right after that is when slavery starts to ramp up in West Africa, in the Caribbean, and in North America. So I think if the Dutch had stayed, slavery would have been just as big probably under them as it would have under the English. But it was, as it happened, it was pretty small under them. But then there's, what you're talking about relates to the development, as I said, when you're in New Jersey and in the Hudson Valley in the 18th century, it's the American colonial period, but there's a lot of persistence. There's a lot of Dutchness that persists. There are a lot of Dutch farms that had a handful of slaves, just as there were English farms and so on, so that was a feature of it. Yes?
How did the Netherlands become a safe haven for minorities? I'm reminded that the Anabaptists were driven out of Germany and Switzerland and became Mennonites.
Yeah.
Holland, I believe.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it's because it's flat and low, but it would seem to me that that's the place where armies could find them and destroy them.
Yeah.
I would flee in the mountains. Do you have any comment on
Yeah.
safe haven?
Yeah, she's asking about how it was the Netherlands became a safe haven for minorities. And it gets back to this notion of individualism and this awareness of individual rights. But it's very much, you have to be careful when you talk about it, because as Americans, you tend to think of that in this idealistic sense. The Dutch were very practical. And, it was, they learned, getting back to the water board and where everybody's sitting around the table, and this is still true in Dutch politics today. It's called the polder model. A polder is an area of land that's been reclaimed from the sea. And the polder model says everybody, if we're the community here and we created this land, then we get together once a month and solve problems. And maybe some of the problems are, these people just arrived from, and they are from a different religious background or whatever. We stay here until we all deal with that issue, until everybody feels like they've had a say. So a lot of Dutch people find it a very frustrating system because, in the American system, it's either yes or no. You either win or you lose. And the Dutch system is we just keep everybody on board. And so this attitude toward minorities is more an attitude of not wanting to rock the boat in kind of a negative sense than anything else. Yes?
I think we have time for just one or two more.
Okay, 2 more questions.
I've heard that the Dutch are the richest people in Europe. Is that still true?
That the Dutch are the richest people in Europe? I don't know. I know the American ambassador in the Netherlands told me a few years ago that the Dutch were the 3rd largest investors in the U.S. So they're very, they're still very good at seeing opportunities and investments. And back to your point of, it's a small country, but, they know how to play the field. Yes?
What of the Dutch innovative spirit remains today? How would you characterize innovation today?
Yeah, what of the Dutch innovative spirit remains today? There are a lot of layers on top of what I've been talking about. Some people would say that the social welfare system has really kind of put a damper on that. Others would dispute that. There are the city of Amsterdam in particular today is, and I've worked with them somewhat because I wrote a book about Amsterdam, so they sort of want to use me in a good way, I guess. They are trying very hard to kind of look at, to amplify that past, to show people, look, we invented a lot of these things that you all take for granted. And in a way, the city is kind of I guess you could say a victim of its own success in that those ideas have become so commonplace now. And Amsterdam it's still a tiny country, and that's a tiny city. And it can't possibly compete with London or New York or these big powerhouses where all these kinds of principles and ideas are really the bedrock of those places. So how does Amsterdam, so one thing they can do is look to their past and look to their history. And so what they're trying to do is they want to be the biggest, the fastest digital portal in Europe and have Schiphol Airport be the model of how airports should function. So they're trying to leverage their size and their history, I think. Thank you all very much. This was fun. Thanks.